Welcome to Your Voice Must Be Heard podcast. I'm your host, Marquita McGee, a happy wife, proud mother, career woman, and voiceover artist. I created this podcast as a place to be encouraged through wisdom for different aspects of life. We all navigate through the many challenges of life, feeling unfulfilled in our purpose, and we believe there's more. We will explore in this podcast keys to unlock the door to the next level and transform. I'll be interviewing people who have found unconventional wisdom that catapulted them to success in business, health, relationships, and their gifts in the arts. We will reflect on how you can apply unconventional wisdom to achieve your success, affirming what you believe and helping you create your transformation story. Come along with me into this week's episode to capture this wisdom and have forward movement in your life. We're on the final pillar for season 1 of this podcast, health and wellness. I chose this category because it's important that we have good health. Without it, it can be hard to have success in other areas of your life and go to the next level. For this pillar, I decided to focus on a more non-traditional way instead of the traditional medicine we're all used to. Traditional medicine has its place, and I thank God for it at times. However, alternative medicine can be just as effective and contribute greatly to our overall health and well-being. We will focus on chiropractic care, which is not just about the spine. In my experience, for over a decade, I've been using chiropractors. At first, it was due to injury. Now it's part of my preventative care to be healthy and stay healthy. This episode is Health and Wellness Part 1, The Human Body, a self-healing, self-regulating organism with Dr. Marco Belizaire. Dr. Belizaire specializes in sports performance optimization. He has worked with a great deal of world and Olympic champions and world record holders in track and field, as well as NFL and NBA athletes, making a positive impact in their performance. As an Olympic-level athlete, he is able to translate the knowledge and expertise of a keen understanding of biomechanical functions of the human body as it relates to increased peak performance from a neuro musculoskeletal point of view to work with the best athletes at all levels. He has the skill set necessary to assess and deliver effective neuromusculoskeletal treatment for accelerating healing from injury, optimizing human performance, predicting and preventing injury. Now, a lot of this interview will be shared from the athletic perspective, but can also be for the everyday person, just with a lot less stressors than the high-performing athlete. There are stressors we deal with as well, from the daily use of technology to sedentary lifestyles. I'll tell you one thing, if we don't correct and optimize our nervous system, our overall health can diminish without us even knowing how or why. We would think it's one problem, but in actuality, the root cause is something else. So let's open our mind to learn a lesson about the human body and how we can improve our quality of life. Today, we have a world-class Olympic athlete and now a world-class doctor of chiropractic with a specialty in sports chiropractic. I'd like to welcome Dr. Marco Belizaire to the show. Welcome, Dr. Marco.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. Okay, you come with such a wealth of knowledge and resource about the healthcare industry as well as the sports industry. So I want to jump right in. You were an Olympic track athlete professional, and you ended up in even greater purpose and call for your life. You were going to medical school, but then you chose chiropractor school instead. Why?
Well, one of the main reasons was when I was doing my undergrad and I was doing my pre-med. When we were part of the pre-professional club, most of the people that were going into the medical field, whether it be medicine or dentistry, to me it seemed more like it's a matter of status rather than okay, I wanna go out and help people.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to admire a lot of the kids that made the dean's list, and I never made the dean's list, but I still had decent grades. but never made the dean's list. And I used to admire them. And we had one particular class, histology, and typically they said that that was the hardest class in the pre-med program. And I was determined to get at least a B in that class. So I remember studying for 15 straight hours for that test. And when I sat down to take the test, the instructor, he had a stroke. So, he was a little bit paralyzed on one side. And while doing the exam, which was mostly essays, I kind of looked to my right and saw some of the kids that I actually admired. They had the open book. And, so I started to laugh. And I said, well, wait a minute. These kids are no more special than me. A couple of years later, one of my teammates, he asked me what I was doing. Once we were about to graduate, and he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm studying for the MCAT, the medical college admission test. But I've also looked into some chiropractic schools." And he said, "Well, I just applied to one, and I got accepted. He just had to pass his physics, and he was going to go." And I said, "Well, the following year was an Olympic year, so I wanted to focus on training to try to make the Olympic team." So I just told him, once you get down there, just let me know and how things were. And he, we kept in touch, and eventually I ended up in chiropractic school, still not knowing if chiropractic was, the route. I just knew it was something different. But what happened was I was sitting down in philosophy class, and the instructor was talking about health, and but unfortunately he didn't look very healthy. So I said to myself, I says, what can you teach me about health? That you don't look very healthy. And I says, I just made an Olympic team. And in his teachings, he said some things that kind of got me off of looking at the wall. He says the human body is a self-healing, self-regulating organism. And I said, okay, now you got my attention. And his next words were, the power that made the body will heal the body. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And at that particular point, I knew, okay, I am in the right profession. So I made it my business from that point on to become the best chiropractic or the best chiropractor that I could be.
That's a great story, finding your purpose through that and going against the grain. Like you said, the popularity thing was going to medical school, but it was more like a status thing for those people. You wanted to make a difference, and that you are doing. Right. And so you've built this great career with sports chiropractic and working with athletes and getting them to their higher level of performance. What is something you do different from other chiropractors?
Well, it's several things I bring to the table, more so than the traditional chiropractor is, first of all, I train and competed at a high level. I have coached and presently still coach at a high level. I help coach Olympic athletes. And I've got specialized training that gives me a special set of skills you won't necessarily see with all chiropractors when it comes to performance care. So my focus is not so much treating an injury or treating symptoms, but rather dealing with performance, simply because the athlete or the high level athlete is putting their body at a much higher level of stress than the general population. So in essence, they're beating up their body. So with you beating up the body needs the proper tools to be able to recover. Okay. If you give it some tools and not the proper tools, you will feel better. But the goal here is not for you to feel better. The goal as a performance athlete is to function better. So an example that I give, a lot of the athletes when I'm working with them, it says, you are a Ferrari. So a Ferrari requires a specialized type of fine tuning. Okay, so because it requires specialized type of fine tuning, he says you don't necessarily take that Ferrari to a minivan mechanic. Okay, so because if you take it to a minivan mechanic, the minivan mechanic might be good at working with minivans, but because you're not a minivan, is not going to make you perform at peak levels. Okay. So it's the same thing with the type of care that I'm rendering. I'm looking for additional things that, because they are taking their bodies to higher levels. So you have to be able to understand how is it that body functions in any specific sport, from a tennis player to a football player to a receiver to a running back to a lineman to a soccer player to an Olympic long jumper versus an Olympic hurdler. Okay, so it's different types of mechanics to an Olympic sprinter. So you have to be able to kind of understand what are some of the mechanisms, in terms of mobility, and what are some of the types of things that will make their body not function at high levels. I specialize in a specific technique called advanced muscle integration. And what this technique focuses on is helping to reset the neurology from the brain to the muscle. Because muscles are the supportive structure of the entire skeletal system, and muscles have a lot of specialized receptors. So when you stress a muscle beyond its ability to adapt, either due to lack of conditioning or the stress is too severe for it to handle, one of two things will happen. Either that muscle will tear, or the brain basically sends a signal to shut the muscle off. Okay, similar to a circuit breaker. Okay, so it's a protective mechanism. But what happens is that muscle still fires, but only in a passive range of motion. Anything that's active will now give you pain where that muscle attaches. Okay, so the brain now has to compute a strategy of adaptation. So what it does is going to shift the joint's angle. Okay, shift the joint's angle. By shifting the joint's angle, it's going to take the stress off of that muscle that has been shut off or inhibited, but unfortunately it's going to put it on the muscle that's right next to it. And what happens is, if we are successful in that adaptation, the pain goes away. But what you have to understand is we are adapting. Okay, so adaptation is not efficiency. So when it comes to the general population, they might be able to get away with certain things. Okay, but a performance athlete, if they're functioning at 85%, okay, when they're requiring their body to function at 100% rather, okay, that body is going to eventually kind of either hit a glass ceiling or basically propose another injury, just another injury. What happens with performance athletes? They become masters at adapting. Put it that way, okay, and they have a keen ability to block pain sensation to the brain. Okay, so what happens is they're so focused, they're able to perform at such high levels that they could bring it down a notch or two, and they're still performing at a high level, but they're not performing at peak levels. Okay, and when you're asking the body to perform at peak levels, that's the difference between having a good game or a good meet versus a great game or a great meet. Okay, so what happens is the body now keeps breaking down, and the body keeps finding ways to adapt, but in the process keeps basically hiding injuries, and keeps creating layers and layers and layers of adaptation. And eventually what happens is the body's going to run out of places to hide these inhibitions, and now you're going to end up with something that's chronic. Okay, so when there's chronicity, what begins to happen is the body, as a way of creating some form of stability, what it's going to do is going to cause the muscles to be chronically tight. Okay, so what happens when the muscles are chronically tight? We have to bear in mind that when we look at stability in the joint, muscles provide 80% of the active stability. So for an example, if I'm raising my arm to create a motion, my muscles are the ones that are supposed to initiate that. So that's 80%. That's the active stability. Okay. When I'm getting to the end range of motion, that's passive stability. That's when the ligaments and the tendons will come into play, basically to prevent me from dislocating my shoulder. In this case, I'm raising my arm. Okay. However, the brain is not going to allow a muscle to engage if that muscle is not capable of stabilizing that joint. So what does a lot of the work is the ligaments, the tendons, the joint capsule. Okay, so that's where you run the risk of, dislocation or a fracture or just a strain. Okay, and at that point, they will give you a diagnosis of tendonitis or capsulitis or bursitis, and you will look at and then they will treat it with perhaps some anti-inflammatories and something like that. And what we have to bear in mind is that this is a chronic issue, and we can't look at the inflammation as the source of the problem. We have to look at what's actually creating that inhibition. Okay. So traditionally what they will do is they will bring down the inflammation. And sometimes if there's some type of restriction, they will try to, perhaps loosen up the muscles and, create a little bit better mobility. But what happens is if you create mobility and not stability, you're predisposing that person to further injury.
Mm.
Okay. So with the technique that we do now, what we assess the functional divisions of each muscle to determine which division is off, and basically by determining which this division is off, we're able to assess which are the positions of instability. So it could be that, say, for example, you strain your hamstring, but in essence, it's not necessarily the hamstring. It's probably the glute that's shut off. But because the glute was not firing properly, it caused the hamstrings to overwork. Then your back gets tight, and you start looking at all the other areas of tightness as that's where the problem, and you treat that, and it feels better. And if you neglect what's actually causing that hamstring, or if in fact it is the hamstring that's actually strained, and you just focus on that area and neglect checking the entire body to see where the areas of compensation, then we end up with that, what do we call vicious cycle. Okay. Reoccurring injuries
Yes.
because we're not necessarily addressing the root cause. So with this technique, what we do when we talk about the functional divisions is when you take the muscle and you strip the fascia off. The fascia is that sheet that covers the muscle that's very rich in nerve endings. Okay. When you strip that fascia, you actually see that the muscles will have divisions, or will have different heads or different points of attachment. And what happens is collectively, as a unit, that entire muscle will create the whole action. But individually, each division functions in a particular position, and that's how we're able to determine, okay, is this division versus this division. So this is probably the mechanism that you're doing it correctly outside. We can treat an issue, but if I'm not able to tell you where it's coming from or what is it that you're possibly doing out there, you're going to go back out there and repeat the same issue. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, mostly of what I'm becoming to you is just a very expensive aspirin.
Wow, this is very enriching. You just gave us a crash course on human anatomy, biomechanics, how the muscles function,
Right.
Through the eyes of an athlete. And so I'd like to apply this to the regular person, this advanced technique that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Do you prescribe this for the regular person? Say that someone who has a very busy active life, or someone who sits a lot at work or drives a lot as part of their work, or they're on their feet a lot. How do you apply this technique? Is it similar to the regular person?
Well, yes, we might not have to do as much work as an athlete will have to do, that you might have to do on an athlete, but nonetheless, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? Some of those people that are not very active, in terms of competitive training, might be weekend warriors.
Mm.
So I'll give you an example. We had a pastor come in here, and he's fairly active, but likes to do flips in the air and play frisbee and things like that. And one of those that he flipped in the air, when he landed, his ankle went in one direction and his body went in the opposite direction. So he basically tore every ligament in his ankle.
Mm.
Okay. So what happened at that point was He was doing rehab. Obviously they had to do surgery, and they did the surgery, and everything looked great. If you look at the X-rays, he had a joint, he had good position with everything. Everything looked solid. However, when he got out of the car, when he came here, he walked like a pirate. Okay, with his legs stiff because he couldn't apply any pressure on it. So he couldn't even preach standing up, because even putting the weight on it, standing up holding the Bible, he couldn't put that pressure on it. He came in, we sat down, took a history, started working, started activating some muscles and obviously adjusting the joints. Okay. And session 3, which was, he was coming from California, so we were doing an intensive. So working a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the afternoon. And, when we had the third session, afterwards, after we activated, I put him on a vibration plate just to kind of, increase some blood flow to the area. And then I said, okay, let's go outside. And he literally went outside and started speed walking. Okay. And then decided, okay, let me start doing a little easy jogging. And he started doing an easy jogging. And then he went behind the car, and I had the other doc that was filming it. And I said, what's wrong with him? He says, he's behind the car. He's in tears. And I said, he's in tears. Okay. Wow. Okay. But, the reason he was in tears is that they told him that if he wanted to be able to walk again without pain, he had to amputate. Or they had to amputate the ankle. Okay, just take his foot off and put a prosthetic. But we were able to do that stuff, and now that passed. So yeah, we did extensive work on him, but he was he's able to do. He's doing triathlons now and things like that. You could still see a visible limp when he runs, but he's able to run.
Yes,
you see? And he had 2 small daughters, 2 and 3. He couldn't pick them up. His wife was pregnant with twins, and he had the 2. He couldn't pick up his 2 little girls. So what happened is, after we worked with him, he went back to California, and then he posts a video on Instagram, and kind of giving his testimony. But in the video, he's walking up the stairs holding both of his daughters in each one of his arms. So he was able to do that, So
nice.
It's obviously is going to benefit. Obviously, because a high performance athlete is putting it's putting their body at a much higher level of stress. In essence, just beating up their body much more than the average person. They need a little bit more care. However, because with so much technology, we don't necessarily practice what we call spinal hygiene, okay? In terms of sitting correctly, standing correctly, when you're with the phone, not sitting down, with your head looking down, sleeping on the stomach, lying down with 2 and 3 pillows, the forms that, the way that how you get in and out of a car. So a lot of things that we do on a daily basis are contributing to it. So these are creating micro traumas. So eventually those micro traumas become something bigger. Okay. And then now all of a sudden you decide that you want to go for a walk. Okay. And you don't properly, warm up before that walk. And all of a sudden when you come back from that walk, now everything is hurting. Your knee is hurting, your ankle is hurting, your hips are hurting, your back is hurting, everything is hurting. Okay. And you think, okay, let me just take something to alleviate the pain, rather than, okay, something could be off. Okay. It could be a joint that's off, or it could be a muscle that's off, that's affecting the joint, and therefore affecting your way of life or your daily activities.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Your Voice Must Be Heard podcast. I hope the story you heard inspired and motivated you to take action for transformation in some aspect of your life. I would love it if you send an email with questions, share your enlightening moment, or profound wisdom you may have. You can also connect with me on Instagram at Your Voice Must Be Heard podcast. I look forward to hearing from you. See you in the next episode. Bye.